So our third objective is to describe how the central nervous system regulates the dual innervation of the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system. Basically how the higher centers of the brain are really integrating all of the events that we've been talking about. So the autonomic function is dually innervated, and we talked about this at the beginning of this discussion. So all of those organs in the middle that we talked about, the pupils, the GI system, smooth muscle of the vascular system, the heart, the lungs, the genitalia, the bladder, all of those autonomic organs and all of those autonomic functions are innervated by both branches of our autonomic nervous system. And so there needs to be a certain degree of balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic activity for our regular everyday function, right? If I'm just sitting here speaking to you, I'm not in a fight or flight mode, not necessarily in an excessive parasympathetic rest or digest mode. And so for normal everyday function of all of our organs, we have both of these systems playing nicely together. So they're in a state of balance. And this is where homeostasis comes in. So this is why both of these divisions are necessary for homeostasis. Because if I lose my sympathetic innervation, guess what? My parasympathetic takes over, and that kicks homeostasis out of balance. And likewise, if I lose my parasympathetic innervation, my sympathetic innervation takes over, and that takes me into an excess state of fight or flight. So in order for everyday function of our tissues and our autonomic glands and muscle and all of that, in order for everyday function, we need balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic, okay? Now, if I do have a parasympathetic event, right, if I'm resting or digesting, I just had a large meal, let's say I had a large Thanksgiving meal, I'm relaxing on the couch, I don't want a sympathetic response. And so I'm going to increase my parasympathetic activity, but likewise, I'm going to tone down or decrease my sympathetic activity as well. So the innovation is always dual. We always got both systems doing something. If I tone up parasympathetic, I need to tone down sympathetic. Otherwise, I'm going to be at the same place that I started. I'm going to negate any changes of either of those systems. And the opposite is true. If you're fleeing from a threat, if you're eliciting that sympathetic response, you don't need the parasympathetic as much, kind of negating that response. And so if you increase sympathetic, you're going to need to tone down or decrease your parasympathetic activity in order to effectively bring about that sympathetic response, okay? It makes no sense for you to be running from a lion or a bear and you have both of those systems activated. That's going to keep you just where you started, which is at rest. Okay. All right. Now, before we move on to this example, I want to mention here that although we've got both systems playing nicely at rest, the parasympathetic system is slightly more dominant than the sympathetic system, okay? So they're not exactly equal. At rest, we always have a little bit more parasympathetic than we do sympathetic, okay? I want to point that out before we move on. So here we're going to walk through an example of the autonomic reflex response. And this is specifically looking at what happens with blood pressure. So typically when we're lying down, we've got most of our blood, let's say we're sitting down, most of our blood is actually pooling in our lower extremities. So if you're sitting down for an extended period of time, most of the blood in your vascular system, because of gravity, is going to pool in your lower extremities. And so when you stand up, there is this automatic response or reflex that moves blood around. And if we did not have the autonomic nervous system bringing about the necessary response, we would essentially black out every time we stand up, okay? But that does not happen because of the events that I'm going to talk about now, okay? So a person stands up, right? And gravity is going to cause all of the blood to pool to their legs. That's a normal response. This happens every time. And so the systemic arteries elsewhere in your body should detect that there's a decrease in blood pressure, right? Because gravity is pooling blood into your lower extremities, your other blood vessels everywhere else in your body, your upper limbs, your core, should detect that most of the blood is now moving to your lower extremities, and so your blood pressure everywhere else will decrease. Now, on our blood vessels in those other areas of the body, we have these visceral receptors. And these are always detecting any changes in pressure. And we call these baroreceptors because they're noticing the difference in stretch of these receptors. And so if the systemic arteries experience a decrease in blood pressure, these visceral receptors will detect that decrease, and they're going to send signals by decreasing the frequency of their action potentials on afferent fibers, right? Two important things that we spoke about already. One is called frequency coding, the fact that we use the difference in frequency of action potentials to relay different signals to the nervous system. The second point here is that we're using afferent fibers. Remember, afferent fibers with an A are fibers that are traveling towards the central nervous system, and they are going to send signals to the central nervous system, specifically the medulla oblongata, where we have those integrating centers, and that is going to bring about a dual response. Okay, remember we said that these organs are dually innervated. The efferent signal with an E here is bringing back the response down to the tissue that needs to bring about a corrective measure, and that happens to be the heart, and that is going to be an increase in the sympathetic activity, but likewise, there needs to be a decrease in the parasympathetic activity. So if my body is detecting a decrease in blood pressure, I need to increase my heart rate to get more blood circulating through my vasculature system. And in order to do so, I need my heart to increase sympathetic innervation. But in order to prevent a blunting of that response, I also need to tone down my parasympathetic influence. And so that is the signal that is sent to the heart and to most of our peripheral blood vessels, and that helps to bring back up the blood pressure. And that is why every time we stand up, we don't black out, because our vessels and our heart and our central nervous system and our autonomic nervous system is taking steps, taking measures to correct the blood pressure and to turn off this signal. So when the blood pressure comes back up because of those corrective measures, this now is sending a negative feedback signal back to the lower extremities so that we can turn off that initial stimulus, and we can signal that the appropriate measures have been made to correct that initial stimulus, okay? And so this is just one example of how the autonomic nervous system maintains homeostasis. This is something that we're never consciously thinking about. This is just happening involuntarily without our permission or awareness. And this is actually one of the important mechanisms that keeps us alive, right? Anytime there's a loss in blood pressure, there are steps that are being taken with these autonomic signals that help to correct those deficiencies in blood pressure. Okay, any questions on that bit before I move on here quickly? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat. All right, so we're gonna wrap up here by looking about sort of connecting how all of this is interrelated to each other. So the regulation of the autonomic function we talked about happens with the balancing of these two divisions of the nervous system. And we mentioned here that parasympathetic is responsible for quiet, relaxed states. We mentioned this as being rest and digest state of the body. This increases gastrointestinal activity. So think about more blood being shunted towards your GI organs and away from your skeletal muscle. We've got closing or we've got constriction, of the pupils because we don't need to be bringing in as much light into the eyes. We've got a decreased heart rate. We've got a decreased blood pressure. We've got an increase in our glandular secretions, which will help in that resting and that digesting of the internal digestive organs. The sympathetic response is going to be the opposite. This is our flight or fight response or freeze. This is preparing us for emergency states, for stress response. This is also elicited during exercise. And this is where blood is being shunted away from the GI organs because we're not digesting food at this time, and towards our skeletal muscle to help prepare for that response, that increase of muscle activity. We're increasing the heart rate, we're increasing the blood pressure, we're actually dilating the pupils so that we can bring more light into the eyes. This is going to help us survey our immediate environment and detect any threats. We're also going to mobilize energy stores. So fat stores are going to be mobilized to break down that fat and liberate energy to do this work. We're going to decrease our GI organs, decrease our urinary function, and decrease glandular secretions like the liver, the pancreas, because we're not digesting food at this time, okay? So these are how both limbs of the sympathetic system kind of correlate to these two states, the rest and digest state, and then the fight or flight or freeze state. So as I mentioned earlier, we have this tonic activity at rest, where although we have both divisions innervating all of our organs at rest, the parasympathetic system is slightly more dominant, and that's what keeps us at rest. So they're not actually equal, but the parasympathetic is slightly a little bit more predominant to keep us in a restful state. And the last thing here that I'll point out is basically how other parts of the brain feed into this autonomic response. So these are the areas of the brain that are in control of regulating the autonomic function. So we talked about the medulla oblongata. This is where we have the respiratory centers, as well as some cardiovascular centers. And then the pons, which is located in the brainstem as well, we also have respiratory and cardiovascular centers. So these centers are controlling the rate of the heart or the rate of our breathing. And these are two important areas that correlate with the fight or flight response or with the rest and digest response. So again, if we're speeding up our cardiovascular function, speeding up the heart rate, speeding up the blood pressure, increasing the blood pressure rather, we're going to elicit that here in the cardiovascular centers. And if we're toning it down, we're also going to elicit that here in the cardiovascular centers. Here I also want to point out the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus also feeds into this. This controls things like our satiety. This controls our blood pressure in some instances. This can also control non-physical elements. So things that are feeding into the hypothalamus about our awareness, about our environment. So the higher centers can feed things like thoughts and memories into the hypothalamus. And this is why if you think about something stressful, or if you had some type of anxiety-stricken event happen, just the thought of those things or just the memory of those things can also trigger some of these cardiovascular responses or changes in our breathing. So it's not just physical stimuli, but we also have some non-physical stimuli that can feed into this autonomic regulation. Okay. All right, and then the last thing here is this really nice summary table. I think there are two parts to this that just show the parasympathetic and the sympathetic response that's brought about on each of the various organs that I mentioned. And so this is a nice table to kind of be familiar with, not necessarily memorize, in terms of understanding how the autonomic function varies with each of these organs that we talked about. So the bladder, the GI tract, the reproductive tract, the pupils, and so on. Okay. Any questions on that? So that brings us to the end of the autonomic nervous system. And if there aren't any questions, we're going to practice one kind of clicker question here, and then we'll pick it up the next time we meet. So I'm kind of playing around with different ways to practice questions. So I'm going to try using the poll this way so that you can actually see the question and see the answer. Just because last time I realized that you weren't able to see the answer. So I'm going to launch the poll in this way, and hopefully you can still see that poll while also seeing the question. Okay, so take a look at the question and then try to poll in an answer. I'm going to give you a minute to do so. Okay. So let's, let me end this. Okay, so we asked here, in the parasympathetic nervous system, which neurotransmitters are released from the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons? And we had quite an overwhelming response for A. So A is the preganglionic releases acetylcholine, the postganglionic releases epinephrine or norepinephrine. And so this is not correct. Let's see what some other people said. So a few other people said B and C. Let's see, B was preganglionic releases epinephrine or norepinephrine, postganglionic acetylcholine. That's also not correct. C says preganglionic releases acetylcholine and postganglionic releases acetylcholine. And so that is correct. So the answer here is C. And let's talk about why. So we're looking specifically at the parasympathetic nervous system, okay? And so we know that norepinephrine and epinephrine never comes in contact with the parasympathetic system. The parasympathetic system only involves acetylcholine. Another thing that I mentioned as a general rule is that all preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. So that would automatically eliminate option B and automatically eliminate option D. Our preganglionic neurons never release norepinephrine or epinephrine. And then specifically because we're speaking about the parasympathetic system, we're not speaking about norepinephrine. This is only for the sympathetic nervous system. So if I were to rephrase this question and ask, in the sympathetic nervous system, which neurotransmitter was released, then the option would be A. But because I'm speaking here about the parasympathetic nervous system, the option is going to be C. Okay, the correct option.